Okay, guys, this is Chapter 24 on the urinary system. Objectives: list the anatomy and physiology of the urinary system, describe kidney function, describe the production and formation and the excretion of urine. Okay? The organs of excretion are fairly straightforward, right? This is how we get rid of waste products from the body so they don't build up to toxic levels and cause damage in the fluid compartments of the body that lead to changes in pH and denaturation of proteins that are lethal. These are the kidneys, the skin, the lungs, and the intestines. The kidneys do the bulk of this. Okay, they're responsible for the maintenance of fluid and electrolyte balance, pH, maintenance of hematocrit, and blood pressure. Okay, and without full kidney function, you would die in about 2 days. Okay, the skin, lungs, and intestines have an excretory function. Only the kidneys fine-tune the excretion of water and electrolytes to maintain normal volume and composition of body fluids. Before the use of dialysis, a person in kidney failure excreted urine through the skin, forming urate crystals. That's called uremic frost. The sweat glands secrete small amounts of nitrogenous components, water, and electrolytes, and the lungs eliminate CO2 and water. Impaired lung function causes retention of CO2 and respiratory acidosis, while the intestines excrete digestive waste. What we want to do here is take an overview of the urinary system. So let's do that.
The urinary system is our friend. No matter how many times it wakes you up in the middle of the night, remember, the urinary system is working for you. Its main job is to constantly remove waste from our bodies by forming urine. It also maintains normal blood composition. So just like a water purification plant filters bad stuff out of water, the urinary system filters waste from the fluids in our bodies and returns good stuff to our blood. The whole urinary system is made up of a pair of kidneys, a pair of ureters, a single urinary bladder, and a single urethra. We'll tackle the kidneys first.
Section A, the kidneys and ureters.
The kidneys are two bean-shaped organs. They're located in the superior lumbar region, an area discussed in the Anatomically Correct World of Anatomy, Part 1.
There are three regions in the kidney: the outer renal cortex, the middle renal medulla, and the inner renal pelvis. The kidneys are responsible for removing nitrogenous waste. That's waste that contains nitrogen. The kidneys remove these wastes by forming urine. This maintains a healthy acid-base fluid balance in the blood.
The main structures that make up the kidneys are tiny blood processing units called nephrons. They are the functional units of the kidneys, the workhorses, you might say. These little nephrons carry out the processes that form urine. And who could ask for a more fulfilling job?
There are over 1 million nephrons in each kidney. Each nephron is made up of a renal corpuscle and a renal tubule.
The renal corpuscle is responsible for glomerular filtration. Glomerular filtration is the first process in urine formation. The renal corpuscle is made up of two structures, the glomerulus and another structure called the glomerular, or Bowman's capsule.
Now, while the glomerulus may sound like a race of different-looking, and therefore evil, creatures from Star Trek, it's not. The glomerulus is actually a small tuft of capillaries. The glomerulus is surrounded by a capsule which is attached to the renal tubule, a structure that we'll give you the details on in just a moment.
The glomerular, or Bowman's capsule, is the other part of the renal corpuscle. Basically, it's a large cup-like structure that completely surrounds and engulfs the glomerulus, kind of like how a broken-in baseball glove engulfs a baseball. And don't forget, Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus also form the renal corpuscle, and it's in this section where the filtration of blood takes place. To sum it up, inside the renal corpuscle, bad stuff go bye-bye. Just remember that the renal corpuscle is in charge of the glomerular filtration. You don't have to know that much detail, because hey, this is anatomy, not physiology. In any event, you do know about the glomerulus now. But still, that's only one of the structures that makes up a nephron. Another structure is the renal tubule.
The renal tubule's job is to selectively reabsorb water and substances like sodium, potassium, calcium, and other important stuff that's needed by the body. It also secretes waste no longer needed by the body.
The renal tubule is divided up into three regions.
These regions are the twisty-turny proximal convoluted tubule, the U-shaped loop of Henle, and the twisty-turny distal convoluted tubule.
The proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT, is the highly coiled region of the renal tubule that is continuous with the glomerular capsule.
Connected to the PCT is the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle is a hairpin loop that links both convoluted tubules, the PCT, and the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT for short. The portion extending from the PCT is called the descending limb of the loop of Henle. The portion connected to the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT, is the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. The distal convoluted tubule, or DCT, emerges from the loop of Henle and forms the final region of the renal tubule. In all of these tubules, water continues to be absorbed and waste continues to be deposited.
We're not going into detail on the formation of urine, so don't feel like you're missing anything. If you want to know more about urine, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Fun with Urine, 2890 Emma Lee Street, Falls Church, Virginia, 22042. You'll be glad you did.
Well, that's the end of the renal tubule. Now, I know there's a lot of confusing loops, tubules, twists, and turns in the renal tubule, but that's because the extra length these curves create allows the renal tubule to process waste more effectively. More surface area means more filtration. So do yourself and the renal tubule a favor and rewind the tape if you're confused or need a review.
When the urine formed in the renal tubules exits the DCT, it's delivered to a collecting duct. The collecting duct collects urine. Wow, what a great hobby.
The collecting duct collects urine from the DCTs of a whole lot of nephrons. You see, the millions of nephrons in your kidneys all have DCTs that empty out into collecting ducts. These collecting ducts deliver the urine to the renal pelvis. Then it flows into a ureter. Remember, each kidney has a ureter, so you have 2 ureters. But unfortunately, before we move on to the ureters, we have to talk about severe kidney disorders.
Sometimes, when a lot of nephrons are damaged or can't function right, a condition known as renal failure occurs. When this happens, people have to undergo dialysis, where they are placed on a machine called a dialysis machine.
Hemodialysis is the most common form of dialysis. In this process, blood is rerouted through a machine that contains a semi-permeable membrane suspended in a bathing solution. The membrane removes wastes from the blood and traps them in a bathing solution. Important substances the body needs can re-enter the blood from the bathing solution. Sometimes, in cases even more severe than this, a kidney transplant is required.
It's true. Renal failure is frightening. But never forget, all those other times when your kidneys are working, that's renal success. And now, on to the ureters.
There's not really much one can say about the ureters. They're really thin. They conduct urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. Pretty simple, huh? Now, the kidneys are an important part of the urinary system, but the precious urine they create would have no place to go were it not for the worm-like ureters, the cavernous urinary bladder, and the muscular urethra.
Section B, the urinary bladder and the urethra.
The urinary bladder and the urethra are the last few rest stops for urine on that highway of relief.
The bladder is a collapsible muscular sac that lies just behind and below the pubic symphysis. The pubic symphysis is the cartilage that connects the 2 sides of the pelvis. The bladder's prime job is to temporarily store the urine that's constantly being produced by the kidneys.
The next adventure on the urine itinerary is the urethra. The urethra is a muscular tube that transports urine from the bladder to the outside world so that everyone can enjoy it. All people.
The urethra contains 2 muscular structures called sphincters. It has an internal urethral sphincter made up of smooth muscle. The internal urethral sphincter is under involuntary control, meaning you can't control it consciously. The other sphincter in the urethra is the external urethral sphincter. It's made up of skeletal muscle and under voluntary control. We'll go into more details on the sphincters in a sec. Just let us elaborate on the urethra for a bit longer.
At 8 inches, the male urethra is a lot longer than the 1.5-inch female urethra. The male urethra also conducts urine and semen, while the female urethra conducts only urine. Well, that's the bladder and the urethra. You should be thankful for these organs. They make micturition, the act of emptying the bladder, possible.
You see, when the bladder fills up with urine, its smooth muscle contracts, causing the internal sphincter to open wide.
So if you're not ready to go because you're in church, running a road race, or dancing with your prom date, your body helps buy you some time.
We can use our external sphincter to temporarily delay the release of urine. You know, hold it in. This is because the external sphincter is under voluntary control.
Unfortunately, this little trick can only work for so long, because the external sphincter will eventually give way to building pressure, and then Niagara Falls. But hey, we're lucky we even have the ability to hold it in, and sometimes we take it for granted. Urinary incontinence is the inability to voluntarily control urination.
Urinary incontinence is normal in infants because babies haven't developed control over their voluntary external sphincter.
Unfortunately, incontinence in adults is usually caused by emotional trauma, pressure from the uterus during pregnancy, and nervous system disorders like multiple sclerosis. So if you're healthy, be thankful for your healthy urethra, as well as your bladder, kidneys, and ureters. By Job, be thankful for your entire urinary system, even on those cold winter nights when nature calls.
Urinary system, 2 kidneys, 2 ureters, bladder, and the urethra. Okay, blood is delivered to the kidney by the renal artery and drained by the renal vein. Okay, renal artery comes right off the abdominal aorta. The renal vein dumps directly into the inferior vena cava. Okay, the kidneys and the ureters are retroperitoneal, meaning that they are behind the peritoneal membrane, basically at the back of your back, at the level of the border between the thoracic and lumbar spine, which means they're not terribly well protected from a blow in that region, which is one of the reasons why generally in contact sports you're not allowed to hit people there. It's considered something called a kidney punch, and it's usually a penalty. Can be very severe. You don't want to knock the kidney loose from its moorings, buckle the ureter, which is the pathway of urine from the kidney to the bladder, and potentially send the organ into failure. Okay, so you can see how close the kidneys are to the back of the back. Okay, you can see the last 2 floating ribs are also near the kidney, and that represents a particular risk because of the possibility of with a blow there, loosening or disrupting a floating rib and puncturing the organ. Okay, so basically it's considered dirty pool to produce trauma in that region on purpose. Okay, even in a bar fight. Right. The kidneys have 2 general regions: the cortex and the medulla, surrounded by a capsule. The cortex contains the renal corpuscles and the proximal and distal convoluted tubules of the nephrons, which are the functional units of the kidney, while the medulla is populated by the renal pyramids, which are these triangular shaped regions that contain parallel loops of Henle, vasa recta, and collecting ducts, as well as papillary ducts. They empty into the minor calyces, which you can see diagrammed here, okay, here and here. Okay, these converge into major calyces, which converge into the renal pelvis, which dumps into the ureter. Okay, the urine isn't technically urine until it enters the papillary duct, which comes off the collecting ducts, and from then on, the urine flows from papillary duct to minor calyx to major calyx to renal pelvis to ureter to bladder to urethra. Okay, blood supply comes from the renal artery and is drained by the renal vein. Okay, the renal artery feeds into the segmental arteries. You can see those here and here and here. They feed into the interlobar arteries. See here and here. Feed into the arcuate arteries. Okay, which feed into the cortical radiate arteries here and here and here. And those feed into the afferent arterioles, which feed into the glomeruli, which feed into the efferent arterioles, which feed into the peritubular capillaries, which feed into the cortical radiate veins, into the arcuate veins, into the interlobar veins, and into the renal vein. And then that feeds into the inferior vena cava. Okay. The kidneys regulate blood volume and electrolyte balance, acid-base balance. They excrete nitrogenous waste, they regulate blood pressure, and they regulate hematocrit. Okay? um, very important functions of the kidney. Um, that's one of the reasons why when the kidneys fail, okay, the potential damage is severe, right? So let's take a look at the nephron and the production of urine.
Urine is formed by three processes in the nephron, the functional part of the kidney. In glomerular filtration, the glomerulus filters water and certain dissolved substances from the plasma of the blood. This results in increased blood pressure, which forces the plasma-like fluid from the blood into Bowman's capsule and then into the tubules. The fluid or filtrate include many positive and negative ions of many elements. The filtrate does not have any proteins or red blood cells, which are too large to pass through the capillary membrane. In tubular reabsorption, substances are transported out of the tubules and back into the blood of the peritubular capillaries. Reabsorption takes place in the proximal tubule, loop of Henle, and distal tubule. The major part of reabsorption occurs in the proximal tubule. About 15% of water is reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. The process is regulated by the hormones vasopressin and aldosterone. In tubular secretion, substances move from the plasma in the peritubular capillaries back into the filtrate in the renal tubules. The proximal tubule secretes creatinine and histamine, and the distal tubule and collecting duct secrete potassium into the filtrate. All the tubules actively secrete hydrogen ions to regulate the pH of the body fluids. The filtrate is now urine. Urine is about 95% water with a balanced urea, uric acid, amino acids, and electrolytes. The daily production is about 0.6 to 2.5 liters per day. Urine production below 30 milliliters per hour indicates possible kidney failure.
One kidney lies on each side of your vertebral column. The kidneys are the primary organs concerned with body fluid and electrolyte regulation. Unneeded fluid and ions are excreted in the urine. Also contained in the urine are metabolic waste products such as urea and uric acid, which form during the breakdown of proteins and nucleic acid. The combination of water, ions, and waste leave the kidneys as urine, which flows through the ureters and into the urinary bladder, which will store the urine until it passes out of the body through the urethra. A renal artery supplies each kidney with blood. The blood is distributed to over 1 million nephrons, the functional units of the kidney. Nephrons are found in the cortex and medulla of the kidney. Each nephron is composed of the renal corpuscle and a renal tubule. The renal corpuscle has two parts, a spherical capillary cluster called the glomerulus and a cup-like container called Bowman's capsule, which surrounds the glomerulus. The renal tubule has three contiguous sections: the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule. Each renal tubule empties into a connecting tubule that leads to a collecting duct. Connecting tubules from many nephrons empty into each collecting duct. Blood reaches the glomerular capillaries through the afferent arteriole. Blood then leaves the glomerulus in the efferent arteriole, which supplies a network of peritubular capillaries. From the peritubular capillaries, capillary loops, the vasa recta, extend alongside the loop of Henle. If we think again of our recycling analogy, we can compare urine formation with throwing both garbage and unused needed materials into a bin, then taking back what we want to keep. Now, before taking the trash out, we add a final few waste items. Urine is formed in 3 steps: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion, which we will discuss in order.
Let's begin with filtration.
Blood pressure within the capillaries of the glomerulus is unusually high because the efferent arteriole is narrower than the afferent arteriole. This bottleneck effect helps to push water and solutes across the capillary walls and into Bowman's capsule.
In doing so, water and solutes cross a filtration membrane consisting of the fenestrated endothelial cells, the lamina densa, and the slit pores created by the podocytes that cover the glomerulus. Blood cells and large proteins are too large to pass through the filtration membrane. As it travels along the nephron, the composition of the tubular fluid changes dramatically. Reabsorption is the second step in urine formation. Most reabsorption occurs along the proximal convoluted tubule. Reabsorbed material moves into the interstitial fluid and then diffuses into the peritubular capillaries. The last step in urine formation is secretion. Additional waste products are pumped into the filtrate. The DCT and collecting systems secrete acids, toxins, and drugs into the tubular fluid. Secretion occurs along the PCT in addition to reabsorption. By the time the tubular fluid reaches the collecting duct, at least 85% of the water and sodium ions have been removed for recycling. The tubular fluid arriving at the turn of the loop is highly concentrated after its journey along the descending limb. Unlike the descending limb, most of the ascending limb is impermeable to both water and solutes. Water is not reabsorbed here, nor can solutes diffuse into the tubular fluid. Sodium ions and chloride are the most abundant ions in the tubular fluid, and large amounts of sodium and chloride are pumped out of the tubular fluid as it travels along the ascending limb.
As these ions are pumped into the peritubular fluid, the solute concentration inside the tubule steadily decreases.
As the solute concentration decreases, fewer sodium and chloride ions are pumped out of the tubular fluid. Thus, the solute pumps along the ascending limb helps to create the concentration gradient responsible for concentrating the tubular fluid in the descending limb. This is a positive feedback loop. The pumping of solutes from the tubular fluid in the ascending limb adds to the concentration gradient within the medulla, which in turn draws additional water from the tubular fluid in the descending limb. The rise in the salt concentration of the tubular fluid reaching the ascending limb further stimulates sodium and chloride transport within the ascending limb. This phenomenon is called countercurrent multiplication. Countercurrent because the tubular fluid in the ascending and descending limbs travel in opposite directions, and multiplication because the positive feedback relationship multiplies the effect on water reabsorption in the descending limb and sodium and chloride transport in the ascending limb. The countercurrent mechanism performs two services for the kidneys. First, it is an efficient way to reabsorb solutes and water before the tubular fluid reaches the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting system. Second, it establishes a solute concentration gradient that will permit the passive reabsorption of water from the fluid in the collecting system as the collecting ducts pass through the medulla.
Aldosterone works on the distal convoluted tubule and the upper collecting duct. It is your salt retaining hormone and potassium excreting hormone. The effects are to increase sodium and water retention. That increases blood volume and blood pressure, and that decreases urine output and urine volume. Okay. Activation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system releases aldosterone into the blood. The most common triggers activating the system are a low blood pressure or reduced blood volume. Okay, so let's take a look at the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system in more detail.
Renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is a classic endocrine system that helps to regulate long-term blood pressure and extracellular volume in the body. The system begins with the release of angiotensinogen into circulation by the liver. This may be in response to low blood pressure and adverse changes in sodium concentrations. An enzyme, renin, is secreted which cleaves angiotensinogen to form the inactive decapeptide angiotensin 1. Further transformation of angiotensin is carried out by angiotensin-converting enzyme, or ACE. This is predominantly found in the pulmonary circulation. However, ACE is also produced in the vascular endothelium of many tissues, including the kidney, adrenal gland, brain, and heart. The angiotensin-converting enzyme converts the inactive precursor angiotensin 1 into the vasoactive peptide angiotensin 2. In addition, alternative pathways exist that do not rely on either renin or ACE. In non-renin pathways, enzymes like tonin and cathepsin D release angiotensin 1 from angiotensinogen and tissue plasminogen activator, or TPA, and can make angiotensin 2 directly from angiotensinogen. This bypasses the midway production of angiotensin 1. Enzymes like chymase can form angiotensin 2 from angiotensin 1 via an ACE-independent pathway. Angiotensin-converting enzyme also degrades bradykinin, which is required for synthesis of a major vasodilator, nitric oxide. Angiotensin 2 binds AT1 receptors expressed on the surface of vascular endothelium and impairs nitric oxide synthesis as well. Reduced bioavailability of nitric oxide, combined with the stimulation of AT1 receptors on smooth muscle cells, causes vasoconstriction. In addition to a vasoconstriction effect, stimulation of AT1 receptor causes the adrenal glands to release the hormone aldosterone, resulting in sodium retention. Combined with vasoconstriction, this increases blood pressure. In the final stages of RAS, the kidney reduces the production of renin. Most of the known actions of angiotensin 2 are mediated through the AT1 receptors, which can be found in the kidney, heart, vascular smooth muscle cells, brain, adrenal glands, platelets, adipocytes, and the placenta. Angiotensin 2 type 2 receptors can be found in low levels mainly in the uterus, adrenal, central nervous system, heart, and kidney. AT2 receptors appear to counteract the effects of AT1 receptor stimulation. Another angiotensin 2 type receptor is the AT4 receptor. Its stimulation may increase synthesis of the natural inhibitor of TPA called PI1, thereby reducing effective fibrinolysis. Stimulation of AT4 receptor appears also to promote cell growth and proliferation.
ADH is released by the posterior pituitary in response to low blood volume or high osmolality of the blood. Water moves out of the collecting duct into tissue spaces and then into peritubular capillaries. ADH decreases the excretion of water and causes excretion of a concentrated urine. Works primarily on the collecting duct of the nephron by determining its permeability to water through the production of special membrane proteins called aquaporins. In an ADH deficiency, this will cause hypovolemia, all right? Excess ADH production, often seen in traumatic head injuries, produces hypervolemia, okay? So the idea here, you retain more fluid, your blood volume and your blood pressure go up, okay? So if you have inappropriate secretion of ADH hormone, okay, that's sometimes called SIADH, all right, you're going to have an elevated blood pressure and blood volume and a reduced urine output. Okay, so it's going to induce oliguria. All right, if you have a deficiency in ADH production, you're going to have hypovolemia. All right, and you're going to have polyuria and polydipsia. Polyuria is excessive urination. Polydipsia is excessive thirst. And there's a condition called diabetes insipidus, which is exactly that etiology, okay? Characteristics of urine: average volume between 1.5 liters every 24 hours, 1.5 to 2 liters, depending. Okay. Polyuria is greater than 1.5 liters every 24 hours. Oliguria less than 400. pH average of 6 with a range between 5 and 8. Specific gravity slightly heavier than water, between 1.001 and 1.035. The color is amber or straw colored. Is deep yellow when you're dehydrated, and it's pale yellow when you're overhydrated. The pH of urine varies with your diet and can range from alkaline to acid. And a urinary high specific gravity indicates dehydration, all right, because you're lacking total body water used to dissolve and eliminate the solutes, okay. Anuria is no urine production. Cause: the kidneys can't produce urine or the bladder won't empty. We treat with catheterization or with drugs. In renal suppression, the kidneys don't produce urine, the patient develops uremia, and treatment is dialysis. Both urinary retention and renal suppression result in a patient that can't urinate. Okay? In urinary retention, the kidneys produce urine, but the bladder won't empty. In renal suppression, the kidneys don't produce urine. Urinary retention is often caused by anticholinergic drugs such as atropine, which can be used in perioperative medication. Okay? The danger, of course, is that if this continues, what happens is that you build up urine in the blood, and that's called uremia, and that can lead to coma and death. Okay? Urine in the blood resulting from renal failure has to be dealt with through dialysis. This is basically an artificial kidney. There's two types. There's hemodialysis and there's peritoneal dialysis. Okay? In hemodialysis, waste and water diffuse out of the tube containing the patient's blood into diazolate, which is basically a fluid. So you basically remove the waste products through diffusion. Whereas in peritoneal dialysis, the diazolate is run to the patient's abdominal pelvic cavity, and the patient's peritoneal membranes act as the dialyzing membrane. After a period of time, the diazolate containing the waste is removed. It takes time, often 4 hours every third day, and so it can be disrupted to the patient's life. Okay? You can do peritoneal diazolate in either an ambulatory or a reclining situation, right? So if you hang the dialysis fluid from a rack with rollers, you can walk around while you're doing the peritoneal dialysis, or you can do it at the bedside with the patient reclining. If we're doing hemodialysis, we have to take the patient to a dialysis clinic where the shunt is used to route their blood through a series of connected tubes that are formed by dialysis membrane, a semi-permeable barrier that allows the waste products to diffuse into the dialysis fluid while the dialysis fluid diffuses into the blood. And after about 4 hours, you're done. Okay. After the nephron, the urine runs to the ureters, to the bladder, and to the urethra. So let's take a look at what results in urination.
The micturition reflex involves impulses traveling from the urinary bladder to the sacral region of the spinal cord and from the sacral region of the spinal cord back to the bladder. It is coordinated by neurons in the spinal cord and can be influenced by signals from the brain. When the urinary bladder becomes stretched, there is an increase in the frequency of action potentials carried from the bladder wall to the sacral region of the spinal cord. In response, parasympathetic neurons from the spinal cord to the bladder are activated, and this causes the smooth muscle on the bladder wall to contract. The sensory signals to the sacral region of the spinal cord also stimulate ascending pathways to the pons and cerebrum, which results in a conscious desire to urinate. If urination is not convenient at the time, the brain sends impulses down the spinal cord to inhibit the micturition reflex. Impulses carried via somatic motor neurons keep the external urinary sphincter contracted, which also prevents urination. When urination is desired, signals from the brain stimulate the micturition reflex. The brain also decreases action potentials in the somatic motor neurons to relax the external urinary sphincter.
The urethra is simply the tube that carries the urine from the bladder to the outside. The muscular layer of the urethra contracts and helps expel the urine during micturition. What is one way the male and female urethra differ? Well, the male urethra is longer, up to 8 inches or longer, while the female urethra is shorter, around 1.5 inches. This is one of the reasons why women are more prone to urinary tract infections than men, because of the shorter urethra and the proximity to the anus. Please let me know if you have any questions.